We have a serious nutrient problem on Cape Cod. There's simply too much nitrogen in our embayments. Most of it comes from human pollution, primarily septic systems, and to a lesser extent, fertilizer from our lawns. Shellfish aquaculture will help filter nitrogen from our saltwater estuaries, but there are limits.
I do like working outside. I feel very fortunate to be here and work close to the earth, dial into the musings of Mother Nature. Our day is usually built around retrieving the oysters at low tide. Today, low tide was at the break of day, thanks to the full moon. Still waiting for the signs of spring to warm us up. Well, at least we're not breaking ice. Right now, the priority is to get the oysters prepared for Wednesday's sale. Once I feel confident that we're prepared for that, then I can do other things like that involve maintaining the crop, switching out trays, sizing the oysters. We want the trays not to be too fouled, especially with that sponge, so it doesn't proliferate. So we're trying to cut down on the biofouling. But the filtering capacity of the oysters is the shining star, is a primary contributor to helping mitigate the nitrogen loading in our bays, and it's through that robust and regular shellfish population that we hope will contribute to cleaning the bays for everyone.
I call them my magnificent bivalves. They take in the nutrients and convert them to meat and shell. And then we are allowed to remove pounds of nitrogen that is measurable.
Aquaculture on Cape Cod is primarily shellfish aquaculture, and primarily two species, quahogs or hard clams, and oysters, the American oyster. We've been talking with a lot of the towns who were facing their wastewater issues, and towns are looking at options on how to address that.
So this is one of our stations here in Barnstable Harbor that the town helps us maintain. This is the town oyster propagation site. And, we do our best to try to get data or water quality data close to shellfish growing areas, as those folks make their living on the water and really want to know what's going on in the water.
Cape Cod and much of the East Coast has just seen a resurgence in oyster aquaculture in particular. Right now there are probably 350 farms in Massachusetts that are farming oysters. They produce about $12 million of product on an annual basis, and that's a doubling in the last 5 years. So it's growing exponentially.
We have traditionally had a wild oyster fishery, but just the natural environment that we're growing in is very conducive to oysters. So you're bringing nutrients from Cape Cod Bay and the ocean in and out every day. You're getting a larger variety of foods, phytoplanktons, that you're not going to get in other areas. That is sort of the natural makeup of Wellfleet that makes it really productive.
It's a huge economic resource. You are feeding people. When you look at the amount of shellfish, seafood that we import, we can be growing a lot of our own, and we'll need to in the future. And so that is definitely an avenue that we should be pursuing. And you're also removing nitrogen as you're harvesting.
These are several dozen oysters that we've grown here at the MBL. I talked about these little aquatic engineers and how efficient they are at filtering the water. And so this is some algae that we grew here at the MBL, but these are naturally available. There, that's a good meal for these guys. And I calculate that in this 5-gallon aquarium, with this many oysters in here, that the oysters should be able to filter the algae out of the water and make it virtually clear in the course of about 2 to 3, maybe 4 hours at the most.
We're in Popp Nauset Bay. The word Popp Nauset derived from the Wampanoag, meaning summer place. Resources were a big part of all Indian life. You couldn't live, you didn't have a store. We moved to the edge of the waters, just down south, summer place, Popp Nauset, because you could harvest fresh fish, shellfish. So it was crucial that these were pure and clean. And as you can look to the sides, the river is packed now with houses. Nitrogen levels from houses, from development up the river has impacted our way of life and our ability to harvest enough to actually sustain. As a part of the Natural Resources Department, we see water quality sampling as extremely important. As a water quality is our way back to our lifeways, the lifeways that we're accustomed to. Working with Constable York, we've been able to develop a really great program in water quality monitoring. We've also, working with Rick, been able to develop an aquaculture project to try and reduce the nitrates in the environment to help the bay come back.
We're growing a couple million oysters seed right now in the river. The oysters have been filtering algae such that we haven't had any fish kills since 2005, and fish kills are increasing in other areas of Cape Cod as the nutrient loads are increasing, the algae blooms are getting worse, and we have a plan to try and clean up the whole bay with oysters. That's our goal. We'll see if we can get there or not.
Aquaculture is kind of one tool in a systematic approach to restoring the health of the rivers and the bays here on the Cape. There's no silver bullet here. You know, we have to be aware of our surroundings and of all approaches, and just be conscious that we're not saying, okay, we've found the solution, so now we can go on as we have, because we need to adapt, and we need to restore a balance, and this is one of the ways to do that.
We also need to treat the nitrogen at the sources, which the biggest source is septic systems on Cape Cod. There's decades of nitrogen that are still coming in the groundwater. So we can use shellfish now to clean up the bays before they get worse.
I think if it wasn't for the oysters, it would be havoc out in the water. I think the quality, there'd be so much nitrogen in the water, you would be getting anoxic bottom, and there'd be nothing alive. I think that, yeah, it's important what we're doing with oysters, and I think they are doing their job, but I don't think that that's an excuse not to be responsible.
I don't think it's realistic to look at shellfish as being the sole source of remediating all of the nitrogen inputs into our waters. These are living organisms, and they can fall prey to predators or disease or weather events, and that would sort of negate the the nitrogen removal that you were depending on those animals taking out.
It's part and parcel of the answer, but I think looking at a wide variety of adaptive management means is going to be important.
We as a tribe have a responsibility because we believe 7 generations we need to prepare for. We do have an opportunity to fix this. We have an opportunity to make it better for the people that go in front of us. Personally, I'm about to be 60 and I haven't done enough to secure my grandchildren's grandchildren some portion of what I had as a child. But if we can bring back any little piece to give them some, that'll make my life a success. And that's all I had to say.
As you have seen, growing shellfish is hard work. Shellfish filter better in the summer than in the winter. Shellfish are susceptible to disease and predation, and not all waters will support shellfishing. Just as important, while shellfish do a great job filtering nitrogen and algae, they are susceptible to other pollutants like heavy metals, PCBs, and some pharmaceuticals. The value of shellfish diminishes if they're not safe to eat. We need to be mindful of everything we flush down the toilets or put on our lawns. The Association to Preserve Cape Cod urges every town to promote our shellfish heritage and have active, publicly supported aquaculture programs. Oysters are not only part of our heritage, they must be part of our future. We all have a role to play in clean water. Oysters can't do it alone. Do your part. Conserve and protect water. Watch the products that you use. Urge your local officials to support local aquaculture. And most of all, enjoy the natural food we produce here on Cape Cod.
Somewhat more complicated in their answer or understandings of the answer now as they were when some of those questions were posed. And it was some of the initial optimism that came with, an uptick in the municipal investment in aquaculture as a mitigation technique. So we're going to have our 2 panelists who know a lot more about this than I do just come up and give some thoughts. 10 minutes or so each, and then we'll have some conversation about where this is all going and what thoughts people have about the role of the shellfish in your town and the Cape as a whole. So, as Kristen mentioned, Josh Reitsma, who starred in the film, from Woods Hole Sea Grant and Cape Cooperative Extensions here, and Mark Faherty of Science Coordinator at Mass Audubon, Wellfleet Bay Wildlife Sanctuary. Maybe you guys might come up to the table and I'll let you arm wrestle on who's going to go first.
You want me to go first?
Sure.
I'll probably go so long that you won't have to go at all.
You could arm wrestle.
Just be thankful I'm not plugging in my hour-and-a-half long PowerPoint I have on my keychain. My understanding is I'm here to talk about really the ecological benefits of oysters and a perspective that really wasn't mentioned in that. It doesn't get mentioned much at all anymore, but for 4 or 5 years, a big part of my life at Wellfleet Bay was overseeing this first of its kind in Massachusetts oyster reef restoration project. And it was a big deal. Nobody knew what this was in Massachusetts. There was no regulatory framework for this. There was no permitting track for this. And it was kind of an exciting thing. And it was, the money came from this partnership between the Nature Conservancy and NOAA. And they funded projects in other states where shellfish restoration was more of a thing. And we learned a lot of different things doing this project, but basically what we did was to put out a series of substrates, 3 different substrates, shell culture, and then a couple of different artificial structures made of concrete, like special concrete that was chemically similar to oyster shell. The idea was to just put these out there in an experimental design and see which was the best at catching a natural set of oysters and keeping them over time. We knew from experience that there were Wellfleet, despite the fact that the natural oyster reefs were long gone, the oyster reefs that were so big that they choked the harbor and were impediments to navigation when Champlain first sailed here. No one remembers that. It's the shifting baseline, so we don't know what we're missing, like with a lot of fisheries. But there's still enough oysters out there that there was natural natural reproduction and natural set. So most places to do oyster restoration, you would have to buy oyster seed, put them on something, and then put them out. At least in Wellfleet, we have enough that you could just put a boot out there and oysters would grow on it. So we were testing these 3 substrates, and we're an environmental organization, and Nature Conservancy and NOAA. I think the goals of these restorations was the ecological restoration of essentially a lost ecosystem. Whether you're talking about Chesapeake Bay or Manhattan, places you've probably heard about recently, the oyster reefs of old are gone, but these were the temperate versions of coral reefs. The oysters are ecosystem engineers, so they created a whole ecosystem. You think about the 3-dimensional reef structure with oysters growing on old oysters, growing on dead oysters, with young ones growing on the old ones, forming this complex 3-dimensional structure, and all the habitat that would provide for invertebrates, juvenile fish, really all kinds of biodiversity. And then, anybody catch the pooping oyster in the video there? No? I was sort of looking for it, but in Scotland Dell's little video there, which was fascinating to me because the oysters didn't even seem to be open, but they cleared out all the algae in that little tank. And you could see they produced what's called pseudofeces, and this is one of the ways that they remove nitrogen, is as they're eating the phytoplankton, filtering that out, and then the pseudofeces goes into the sediments and does a couple of different things that helps remove nitrogen. First of all, it could just go into the sediment and then get buried, locked up. But then they also facilitate microbial denitrification, where you take that problem nitrogen and then microbes in the sediment turn it into nitrogen gas, which is harmless, is not pollution in the water anymore, and they bubble that out. And so that's one of the important things that they do. I'm really rambling. Is anybody still listening? So anyway, I want to talk about just the different ecological benefits of an intact oyster reef. And so we talked about denitrification, talked about habitat for fish and vertebrates, erosion protection. I mean, this has come up a lot since Hurricane Sandy, that these big reefs provided a wave break. And there's everything I'm talking about, there's a lot of published, peer-reviewed research behind it. It's not just like common sense kind of things that I'm pulling out of the air. There's a big body of research about all of these ecological benefits of oyster reefs, from denitrification to erosion control, erosion protection of shorelines. But they've done some work constructing reefs down south and looking at the reduction of wave energy, protecting salt marshes behind them, that kind of thing. And I think that's still an active area of research. But not most of these things, to some extent, can be accomplished by oyster farming. And oyster farming is very important. It's a very clean and green kind of farming, but it's not the same. And I think we have to keep that in mind. That's not a wild oyster reef that stays intact, and oysters are allowed to die of old age. And it builds up over time. It gets bigger so it can resist the ice flows that we see sometimes in the winter. So we did that project for 3 years. We learned some important things, including the 50,000 permits we didn't know we needed. We were done with the project before we had all the permits we needed. 4 years later, we finally got the last permit we needed for that project. We learned that oyster castles, which were one of these concrete structures, was by far the best of the 3 things that we tested: oyster balls, oyster castles, and culch. We learned that surf clam culch is better than oyster shell culch at catching spat and growing oysters over time. But we also learned that the state is not really interested in oyster restoration or no-take sanctuaries. And that was in 2012, and I kind of checked back into that world. I contacted someone at the Nature Conservancy and did some looking around online, and I don't think anything has really changed. One of the things we were hoping was that our project would pave the way for oyster restoration the way it's been done for decades in other states. I'm talking about like South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia. Oyster restoration for ecological reasons, for the sake of restoring oyster reefs, restoring them as essential fish habitat, where some of the subtidal reefs they restored in like the Carolinas, they provide maps of them to fishermen because the fishing is so good around those constructed reefs. Putting shell back into the system like they do in the Carolinas. Other states have a long history of this, no-take sanctuaries. But we just don't have that still in Massachusetts. Nature Conservancy did a feasibility study. They got a grant from MassBays a few years back to explore this further, and I think the end result was like, DMF still doesn't want to do oyster restoration in Massachusetts, and that's pretty disappointing to me because it's worth doing. Other states have a long history of doing it, and I think it's an important thing to do. But we have this law that Josh was sort of reminding me of. You can close an oyster restoration site for 3 years, but then it has to be open to harvest, which is not how it's done in other states. You should be able to have rotating closures or have areas that are just a spawning sanctuary. Think of it as a spawning sanctuary. Because one of the ecological benefits of a wild reef is more spat in the system that could benefit commercial pickers that pick some of the remaining wild oysters out there. So anyway, that's where things stand in Massachusetts anyway. And our project ended in 2012, and we were looking for funding to do a second round, which didn't come in. Ultimately, ICE did the project in addition to the glacial pace of change at DMF, we had actual ice that came in and crushed some of what we had left out there. I haven't been out there in a few years. But I think if you pick the right site, there's certainly the potential to do ecological oyster reef restoration in Massachusetts, and we should be doing it.
All right. Restoration. Yeah, definitely is a part of oyster production coastwide. Chesapeake is huge with it. But So going back to the video, I'm just gonna make a few comments. I don't have any real planned comments here, but the importance of oysters, you usually look at the social, economic, and also ecological importance of the species. And, you know, Wellfleet, more than any community, I think, in Massachusetts, the social importance is huge. The jobs, and, you know, not just jobs, but occupations that people make a living off the water, a traditional way of making a living in coastal areas. And, you know, that being embraced by the community around it, you know, it's challenging, it's very visible. Not everybody likes it, but, you know, you see it more in Wellfleet than any other area, I think, on the Cape, that, you know, the community really has, you know, become associated with oysters. And I can't tell you how many times I see a Wellfleet oyster sticker in, like, Maryland or, you know, somewhere in Ohio when I travel to see family or something. It's just incredible you know, the social value of oysters to Wellfleet. And then along those lines, the economic importance, of course, there's jobs and income associated with that. The last couple of years, I think oysters have been around $50 million worth of value to the state, just farm-made value. And it's mostly farm-raised these days. Besides Wellfleet, there's very little wild harvest of oysters in the state. So $50 million worth, that puts it third in seafood being harvested in the state. It's behind only lobsters and sea scallops, which of course are huge traditional fisheries. So gone are the days where haddock and cod are the staples of our fisheries. Now we see an aquaculture product being the third, you know, most valuable seafood product in the state. And, you know, that tells a tale of how important they are to our region. You know. And then the ecological importance, again, Mark went into that. You know, there's multiple facets to that. You know, they do provide habitat, and then there's the nutrient cycling. And, you know, before we get into nitrogen, I would just stress the fact that these shellfish are in the environment and they're you know, in a role within the ecosystem as filter feeders. That cycling of the phytoplankton is important just on its own. You know, just the fact that phytoplankton does not become dominant in the system because there are filter feeders to hold it in check. And, you know, the checks and balances within the ecosystem are really important. And as we've seen over the years, and as habitat degrades, a lot of times we see less and less of our traditional shellfish in a lot of areas in the Cape. So that's an important piece. And, you know, a lot of what the video went into, and I think what I was asked to speak to tonight is the nitrogen mitigation potential with them. And this was 4 or 5 years old, and as Andrew kind of got into, is we're still trying to figure it out. Can they really be an important role in mitigating the issue that we've caused? Too much nitrogen in the system. And, you know, it's a problem that we've caused, so, you know, just on the outside looking down, you know, do we really want to ask shellfish to fix our problem? I mean, that's kind of ridiculous when you think about it. But they are avid filter feeders. They do have a role in the nitrogen system, and you know, maybe there's potential there to use that. But, you know, I'm familiar with a bunch of projects on the Cape, and, you know, they have several years of data now, and none of them are really conclusive that, you know, they're going to have the impact that they want them to have in the environment. So that silver bullet idea, I think Quan Toby said it, you know, we don't expect it to be a silver bullet, but, you know, there's a lot of people who had banked on that, unfortunately, because they are an attractive option. It's fairly cheap to put shellfish out. It's fairly quick. You can do it fairly quickly, you know, within a year, as opposed to putting pipes in the ground and wastewater treatment systems. So, you know, it does have that attractability, but there is a lot of challenges with it. You know, it's a lot of work to grow. The amount of shellfish you need to grow to remove, you know, the amount of nitrogen you need to do. There are problems with the market. You know, we have a few projects going on right now, and they're putting stuff out to market now, and it happens to come at a time of the year when the market's already somewhat saturated, and it just plummets the price, and, you know, it becomes a bit of a subsidized fishery, and the fishermen will sell them then because they can for whatever the wholesaler is going to give them, and, you know, there's this very dramatic issue there about what to do with the market aspects And then, just in the water quality alone, the data that I've seen, it's not really showing what we wanted to see. And I think, without significant source control, it's going to be tough to ask shellfish in the environment to sort of clean up our problem. And that's, sort of what I've seen in the conversation over the years, being involved with this over the last 8 years or so is, people were really excited about it, and it's like, yeah, this is going to be a major source of nitrogen reduction in our community. And over time, it's like, all right, well, maybe this is something we can do in the next 5 years until we get something in the ground to really get to source control. So I think the consensus over time has been shifting a little bit in that, they're definitely not a silver bullet, and maybe they are something we can use in the interim while we get our stuff figured out into how we're going to control the source of nitrogen. But yeah, they're not the panacea we had all hoped. Well, not we all hoped, but that some had hoped that they would be. So I guess that's my 2 cents on the situation.
Okay, thanks. We don't want this to be a total downer. But most of you from Wellfleet, so you mostly focus on what Wellfleet's doing. Let me just give you a little bit of perspective. You saw that a lot of film was in Mashpee. And part of the reason for that was, like many towns, Mashpee came up with a wastewater management plan that went to the selectmen. Selectmen said, yeah, we're not doing that. And the town mayor just said, we're not doing that, because it was $500 million. They said, go back and figure something else out. And so they came back with a plan that was heavily reliant on shellfish propagation. And Rick's, an evangelical shellfish guy. And he weaves a good tale, and it all sounds great. And for $1 million in investment in shellfish propagation, you could save $190 million in capital investment on source control. Well, everybody said, well, we like that. So there was this move towards doing more shellfish propagation in Mashpee. No movement on the source control side. And it became, well, we're going to do that, and we're going to see how that's going to work. And we don't really understand it as a bunch of political people. And nobody talks anything about the ecological restoration value. It's just, like I said, $1 million and not spend $190 million. I like that. And as Josh said, the results have been kind of mixed. Rick will still tell you it's working great. Not to put words in anybody's mouth, but not as many other people. I had a hard time getting that validated. And so we kind of sit in this limbo of sort of doing a half-hearted wastewater management program through some investment in oysters, and we're doing it enough to say that we're doing something, but we're really not doing the program that Rick articulated that he wanted. We're not actively resourcing that, and we're doing zero on the source control side. And so, 5 years after this sort of initial burst of enthusiasm, just speaking as an individual member of my own board, flipping hats for a minute, I'm extremely frustrated and somewhat discouraged about the public process's ability to get its mind around this problem and decide how it wants to do it. And, what I'm concerned about a little bit is that some of the lack of clarity about the results is going to be further used as an excuse to sort of, well, let's wait some more. We're not really sure. There's a lot of cynical reasons to wait for shellfish. And whether people actually want it to succeed or not, that's who you're talking to. So, we're at this weird time, I think, where, we have a region-wide plan that sort of deals with alternatives as a significant portion of the solution. Still relies fairly heavily in a lot of instances on collection and treatment, scaled to the individual municipality's needs. And there's new revenue streams to support that. and yet the political will around getting going is still a little bit uncertain. And so, I think it's hard to talk about this issue without bringing up this broader context of how towns are going to be dealing with their overall wastewater management needs. And then you have looming litigation out there, and so it's really hard to tell where it's all going to go. I think the part that gets lost was the part these guys are highlighting, which is there's just plain value in restoring a species which is natural to this region and has a multitude of environmental benefits that don't just serve as our immediate needs to save money on wastewater. And so should we be doing that anyway? Is a pretty fair question to be asking. And shouldn't you be doing it perhaps without the pressure of saying, if it doesn't yield exactly the results that we anticipate on nitrogen reduction, that the whole thing's a failure and what the hell we're doing anyway, everyone else know what we talk about. So it's a really complicated and somewhat circular defeatist environment that we're working in a little bit. But there's value there. There's underlying value for a variety of reasons that got touched on. So I think engaging people in this conversation, trying to figure out as a broader community, when you're a town or your towns that you represent, plus the region as a whole, what role do we want this biological system to play in what we're trying to promote and what we're trying to restore and why and what the motivations are still aren't all that clear. So I don't think I took the mood up. But if somebody other than Kurt want to ask a question, I'm not going to give you the first question.
First of all, have you ever heard of the hockey stick? Old hockey sticks being used to propagate oysters? Okay.
No.
Okay.
I heard of sticks, but not hockey
Okay,
sticks.
the old hockey sticks.
I thought that was a climate change question.
With six or composite sticks.
I'm just wondering, you said in the Carolinas, I believe that they were building oyster reefs, and maybe they're not able to harvest the wild oysters there?
They do, but they are more progressive than we are and have been for decades. They have no-take sanctuaries are a part of it.
Right.
I think they do some propagation, but there's wild harvest.
Okay, now do you...
Probably more, and part of it is we're more aquaculture, they're more wild harvest.
Okay.
And so they do more to promote the growth of wild oysters.
So do you think if there was an oyster reef built here, not able to take the oysters at the nitrogen levels would go down?
No, I've never heard of a scientist in the 11 years I've been in this world, in the kind of shellfish world, I've not heard a scientist say, yes, oysters are all you need and no one will ever need to sewer. All this stuff is just delaying the inevitable and it's sort of unfortunate. I'm all for anything that gets people wanting to put more oysters in the water, but I don't think anybody credible was ever thought that this would be the answer to nitrogen in Cape Cod waters. And meanwhile, things have been getting worse. And again, I think delaying the inevitable.
I mean, think about it for a minute. We're behind South Carolina. Right? That hurts.
How do we change the mindset that you have to harvest every oyster after 3 years? I mean,
I don't think they feel that you have to harvest every oyster, but there is that old state statute. And part of it is there's pressure from a lot of groups to put shellfish in prohibited areas for harvest. And that's the real concern by the state. Is like they don't want to open up the door for a bunch of groups to come in and put them in, like a lot of like inner Boston Harbor, say even New Bedford Harbor or something. And that becomes a liability from their perspective. They call it an attractive nuisance. Poachers come in, they take them, put them on the market, and who knows what they have in them, and somebody gets sick, and that hurts the $50 million industry that the aquaculturists have built. So that's the underlying fear there, and so they have that protection from that law, that old statute, but yeah, they're not opposed to rotational management. I mean, they've really softened over the years that, I've heard, even if it's open for 1 hour in a year.
Yeah, open it for an hour on Christmas Eve.
That's what Andy Koch was going to do when we went for ours.
Yeah, I mean, the statute by doing that, you got to get creative with it and work around it. But they have fears about bigger things happening in areas that could cause real problems down the road.
Helen and then Kurt.
yeah,
So to tag on to the idea of not so good oysters to eat being harvested, how much science has been done on what else gets included in the oyster's tissue besides, other than what would normally be there when they're found or when their habitat has other pollution? In other words, how much science has been done on that? Because they're taking in a lot of things that they aren't necessarily processing, as well as nitrogen. You know,
the Center for Coastal Studies is doing a project. I haven't seen any results. I think I just saw it on their website. They were looking at things like heavy metals accumulation, stuff that I've wondered about. And I'm like, I don't think I've ever seen anything about that, because there's pathogens, but then there's other things like pollutants. Like big predatory fish accumulate mercury, things like that,
and chemicals from businesses near,
They're short-lived, so they don't have a lot of time to accumulate things, but they are looking at that at Center for Coastal Studies. I don't know that the results are in.
Yeah.
Correct.
A couple things. EPA has a long-term monitoring program for heavy metals and a variety of other contaminants in fish and shellfish. And actually, Falmouth is one of the locations where they do periodic sampling, and so that's a long-term database that they're maintaining. Obviously, it's not inclusive of everywhere where shellfish is being harvested or fish are being caught, but the EPA does have a long-term monitoring program specifically to address that concern. The other thing is DMF has actually eased up just a tweak, and that is that in the shellfish planting guidelines that they revised in, I think it was 2014, allow a municipality to engage in reef restoration or restoration for its own sake as a strategy, with the caveat that within 5 years you have to be able to restate that it's continuing to serve its public purpose. So in other words, you can do something for public benefit. It doesn't have to be harvested, but you have to come back and show them that it's continuing to meet that objective. Otherwise, it needs to be harvested. So there is a little bit of daylight there to address Barbara's concern about, why do we have to keep removing them from the water? The other thing is, just as another point of information, at Wellfleet, in terms of source reduction, that gets talked about a lot. I don't think there's any question that it would be irresponsible to, avoid source reduction and, pretend like that doesn't matter. I think there's some really exciting technologies that work on source reduction that George Hoyfeld is working on with his layer cake, technology around septic systems. One of the problems with sewage treatment systems is that they tend to concentrate the pollutants. So you can have actually adverse outcomes as far as contaminants of emerging concern and a variety of other things just by installing a wastewater treatment system. So it's a very difficult issue. I don't think there's clear answers one way or another. One of the things that the Silent Spring Institute found when they were doing some analysis on the materials that are coming out of sewage treatment plants versus, and this is around contaminants of emerging concern, versus septic systems, and they're finding lower levels coming out of septic systems than sewage treatment systems because the biomat and the environment were actually breaking down some of those compounds somewhat more effectively. And George's layer cake, which puts wood-based materials around the leach field, actually shows a very high removal rate, similar to what John Todd found with his little experiment at New Alchemy like 15 or 20 years ago. That you can actually take natural systems and remove heavy metals, cadmium, mercury, lead, and PCBs and other things out of streams with natural processes. So I think that's exciting because it does mean that even septic systems can be improved. The last thing is kind of a question, I guess, from Mark, and that would be, given the fact that we had 36 billion oysters in Wellfleet Harbor back around the time of Champlain, and we have close to zero in terms of natural, not talking about aquaculture, the wild fishery, but zero reef, what would be a level that would make sense as far as a healthy ecosystem?
Yeah, I think that's impossible to answer. It is something. I think, I don't know, I can't give you like an acreage, but start with something. Have an oyster reef that's allowed to grow over time without being broken up. I mean, harvesting also kind of breaks up the structure of it. So it should be allowed to build up over time, and you would have to do it somewhere other than I think where we did it, where it was pretty high energy off Lieutenant Island, kind of high energy and exposed to that ice in the winter. But just start doing it and looking at the results, and then go from there. But yeah, there's really nothing to speak of. I think there were 1,000 in the 70s, as recently as then. There were 1,000 bushels of oysters around Lieutenant Island, according to the Curley report. Some of you, I think, might know what that is. But yeah, like I said, nobody remembers the big oyster reefs. Just like nobody remembers that cod used to be the size of this table, and those people that aren't alive anymore don't remember that. So now we think cod are this big, and then you go from there. It's the shifting baseline. But yeah, it'd be good to get some reefs out there and see what happens.
One thing, if you could elaborate too on the ecosystem piece of it. The natural transect used to be salt marsh, oyster reef, and eelgrass, which is obviously missing. What ecosystem function does that kind of network serve?
The network of salt marsh?
Yeah, salt marsh, oyster reef, and then ultimately eelgrass, as far as the natural ecosystem that used to be out there.
I'm not sure you're at. I mean, those are like incredibly important. I mean, I wouldn't even know where to begin, but thank you for, I totally forgot the connection between oyster reefs and eelgrass, where by clearing the water, by filtering the water and making it more clear, more sunlight can reach the bottom, and that facilitates eelgrass growth. And I think a lot of the issues with eelgrass is too many nutrients. And so oysters and eelgrass can work together in that way. And eelgrass is, I think most of you know, an incredibly important habitat for juvenile fish, but especially things like bay scallops. And a lot of that is missing as well. So it's all connected. I mean, an oyster reef can protect a salt marsh from the erosion, especially as sea level rise is threatening our salt marshes, especially the high marsh, and can clear the water to promote eelgrass growth. I mean, all of these things are working together in ways that we're not aware of anymore.
Just to add to some of the complexity of the conversation, we're talking about this question on source control tonight, and very often solely as a nutrient management question. So you do get some of the issues that Kurt raised about relative performance of septic systems versus centralized treatment at discharge locations, the somewhat random nature of what septic systems treat and don't treat versus what the engineered systems provide. But then you layer on the issues around drinking water. And the diffuse nature of septic system discharges, the proximity to private wells, their ability to be sited in areas that recharge public wells, whereas centralized treatment discharge locations have to be outside of zone 2s. So when you start layering on the question about whether centralized or septic systems are the right answer for the community as a water resources management question, gets exponentially more complicated. And this whole issue of emerging concerns is a difficult one, because we know about that much about this many chemicals. Right now, this CEC list is huge. It's not getting chipped away at in any meaningful way. EPA has walked away from the table on standard setting under this administration. And even where they are setting standards, they've changed the basis upon which standards are being evaluated so that they're fundamentally not protective of the public health from a consumer perspective. And then when you layer on the fact that you've got analyses that are struggling to find the health level of a given chemical let alone the impact of that chemical in combination and concert with a whole range of other contaminants that might be found in drinking water supplies now. We don't know anything about anything when it comes to that world. And so there's a school of thought, and I'm not sure I subscribe to it, that centralizing the treatment, even though you concentrate the effluent discharge, gives you a single point upon which to build secondary and tertiary treatment trains that pick up stuff that you didn't even know was there or know to care about when the system was designed, versus putting it out in the septic system world, which is still a relatively stupid technology. It's very passive. It treats what it treats, and it does break down some biologics, and it does break down some chemicals that pass through either contaminants from household product usage or stuff you consume and then excrete into the water. But there's no real rhyme or reason, and nobody really has a really good handle on what the effluent quality coming out of septic systems is for a wide range of chemicals. And if you rely on that diffuse system and you all of a sudden get something that is new that you didn't know you had to worry about, you've got right now, trying to remember the number of septic systems that we have, a couple 100,000 septic systems on Cape Cod. Then what do you do with it? If you've made the investment in maintaining that technology and that infrastructure, and it's not protected, forget the nutrient loading aspects of resources, but the human public health side of it. And I'm not saying there's a right answer or a wrong answer, it's just really complicated.
Yeah, but it's not exactly entirely true that there's not a lot known about the biological. I mean, even some of the best treatment technologies in central collection systems are biologically based. Running reverse osmosis is prohibitively expensive. That clearly gets rid of everything. But they're biologically based, and septic systems duplicate that.
But at a much cruder level.
Well, the biomimicking is really I think the field that's very interesting right now. And so I just would caution you to be a little bit, you said we don't know a lot about this, and I agree. And I think there's there's different schools of thought between engineers and biologists about ultimately what's going to be the best solution out there, what's going to work the best.
But
I wouldn't dismiss biomimicking.
I'm not dismissing it, but I guess one of the things that people should go home and think about tonight, at what point do you know enough in order to make a decision about which way you want to go? We don't know enough about George's layer cake. We don't know what its long-term performance is. It's not even really partly through the pilot stage. It's years away from general use. At what point do you stop delaying investment, waiting for the right investment, and allowing the systems to continue to degrade, which is politically what we have done as a broader community on a whole range of things. But on this one in particular, we've kind of bumped around. I want to get around to everybody first. We've bumped around with different approaches. Oysters are one, alternative septic systems are another. The ones that are being judged at the base are another. And during the course of this conversation, the standard that DEP just put out, announced today, for perfluorinated compounds, stuff that's in all your Gore-Tex that kept you warm, dry today, for a cleanup standard, is 20 parts per trillion right now, okay? When I started working at DEP in the 1980s, our drinking water standards were parts per million. So we're now regulating a compound that we weren't worried about up until 5 or 6 years ago, at a level that 20 years ago, when a lot of this infrastructure was being built, we couldn't even detect. If it had been there, it probably was, at the levels we're regulating it now, with the sampling technology that was available, we just said, no detect, clean water, you're good. And so it's an ever-evolving field where there's as much certainty as uncertainty, and at what point do we not allow ourselves to be paralyzed by the uncertainty and do nothing, and the effect of doing nothing is all these resources are disappearing. You've been trying to get into that.
Yeah, hi. My name is Nancy. I'm just speaking from
say in the estuary type of line. And the last 3 years have been undoubtedly the most change I have ever seen in the inner harbor. The first year, which was 3 years ago, my oysters didn't even grow. They were orange, the ones I had on the ground. They used to be a briny, greenish brown. And Chipman's Cove, you see one true oysterman out there? We always used to say that Chipman's Cove takes care of itself. And it was. It was the most beautiful place to oyster. Lots of people out there. Duck Creek. Now, whether it's because the harbor hasn't been dredged, but I was here on the last time it was dredged, and, you know, there wasn't a problem until 3 years ago, and it continues to this day, and I've never seen the inner harbor. My opinion, the only type of reef that you can grow without ice problems and nothing intertidal. This isn't Wellfleet I'm speaking of. Nothing in by the, you know, Chipman's Cove or probably even down by the river. But would be in deep water where there's no tidal fairness at low tide. That's where, until, you know, all these things you're speaking of, with, you know, rainwater wash up, there could be acid rain. But there's something wrong. That's all I know. Never seen the oyster that sickly looking.
Thank you.
In my area.
Other questions, comments? Yeah. I'll get back to you.
We're from Orleans, which is one of the towns that's been seduced into spending some oyster money. And listening to the conversation over the years, it seems as though the scientists are like the climate scientists were up until the very recent past, which is cautious about making some absolute statements. I would love to hear somebody who knew his or her stuff say the dollar for wastewater is ill spent on oysters. And I don't know why they can't say that. Why is it so difficult to look at, if you have 1,000 oysters, and in Orleans they float them, so they don't even come close to creating reefs or contributing to the environment other than perhaps removing some degree of nitrogen. But why is there not a way to simply calculate how many units of nitrogen are removed per 1,000 or million oysters, take into account their nitrogen poop and removing them? Why is that so difficult?
Oh, there is a way. The challenge is the ecosystem is very variable. Mm-hmm. And so you could give me a bucket of oysters and I can tell you how much nitrogen is in them by weighing them and using some averages. I can give you a pretty good value. But whether you're going to see that effect in the ecosystem of that nitrogen reduction is the huge question. And that's what DEP wants to see. And, are these sentinel stations showing an effective nitrogen removal from the system that, we're expecting to see? And
is that because?
So that's why there's all these pilot projects going on, trying to prove that. So they're trying to meet, targets. There's calculations you can make. They're fairly simple. We know kind of what's in an oyster or co-op. But the ecosystem is so variable. And, like you said, their feces and pseudo-feces, the way it interacts with the bottom, the algal blooms, the way they decay in the system, and, the successive nitrogen cycling. It's all very, very complicated. So right now, oysters have never really been used for this purpose before, like to remove nitrogen from the system. We've always known they're part of the system, but as a removal project, they've never been used that way. So there's really no success story anywhere in the world that I'm aware of. I mean, there's successes in, you know, clearing the water.
Isn't that the message then?
I think the message is, you know, part of it is, you know, that the regulatory world is not set up for this kind of natural variability. So the whole system, I said, you know, it's around the Sentinel station. Can you meet a number of reductions? So you need to take 10 pounds of nitrogen out at this particular Sentinel station, and you can achieve compliance if you bring that down. You might not achieve the environmental restoration, water quality, habitat goals that are also part of the standard, but put that aside for a minute. And so the whole 40 years of Clean Water Act regulation is based around how do you get to the number. And the reason you don't want to get sued is a federal judge will say, well, how do I get to the number? I can get to the number by connecting everybody to a treatment plant. I can measure the number at the outlet of the pipe. And so the regulators can say, this is how much wastewater we collected, this is what the load was, this is what we took out, here's the effluent, Your Honor, we met the numerical standard. And that's what they want. What they don't want, and what the regulators have grown up not trained to think about, is, well, you know, you can take out a certain amount of nitrogen out of each number of animals, you do this multiplication, but we don't know how that translates into the real world in terms of how much nitrogen comes out of the water column in a given year. You know, how do you deal with, you know, I mean, part of the, you know, my experience in this conversation is, you know, what we had in Mashpee. You know, did our program, had a couple of years where water quality got a little bit better. Then we had 2 summers where we had, you know, the new world of 4 and 5 inch rainstorms, and you had a massive amount of nutrients washing in from the land side into the water body. Water quality got worse. Did that mean the shellfish were a failure? I don't know. But you don't get, it doesn't move you to the number. And so, you know, the system isn't geared toward the answer you want, because the world doesn't work, unfortunately, the way that thought process would lead. It doesn't.
But my question is, why do we keep trying to get the answer when, you know, all it takes is a seal to swim by and pee the nitrogen and it throws the numbers off? We're pretending that we can design a system to get the number that someone told us we need to get.
Well, you can design a system. I think the experiment here and the curiosity, and I think it's a worthwhile endeavor, is to figure out, does it all have to be engineered, hard pipe, hard scale solutions? What's the role of enhanced natural systems? Just back to what they were. Not anything supercharged from what, you know, has historically been seen, but just back to where they were, and how does that take the edge off relying solely on technology? And, oh, by the way, there's all sorts of secondary benefits to the environment, most of which we probably don't even understand yet, of having systems that have been evolved to serve the needs of the ecosystem that we wiped out. And so, even by itself, you know, in many respects, I don't know what you guys think about it, but whether the discussion around shellfish reintroduction, propagation would be easier without the pressure of it's the solution to a $4 billion problem. Maybe we'd make more progress if people weren't quite so, well, what about this? And, you know, have this extraordinary investment in proving that every little bit of progress is proof of concept and every step back is a condemnation of it, which really kind of seems to where we are right now.
Yeah, I mean, I've worked with these shellfish propagation programs in towns for years, and they never saw any money. No one ever puts any money into it. And then nitrogen came along. It's like, boom, $1 million, fix our problem. So, I mean, no one's ever really embraced the restoration aspect of it. I mean, and until it was a water quality thing, and then there was one involved in it.
Right, so if it became an excuse not to have to make me build sewers and do the debt solution to build the sewers, I love your oysters. That's it.
Isn't there a big problem in New England with the seasonality of the ability of oysters to do this anyway? I mean, it's cold here. of the year. So, I mean, I firmly believe in restoration for ecosystem services, but I really don't see this being a realistic way year-round to solve our problems.
The nitrogen curve it peaks in the summertime.
Sure.
So the oysters are actually consistent with when you have the most nitrogen. So the highest levels of filtration, the highest levels of activity of oysters are actually coincident with the highest amounts of nitrogen.
That's the highest amount of nitrogen loading into the groundwater, but the time sequencing and the delivery of that nitrogen to the water body doesn't necessarily sync up with our seasonal population cycle. In some places it does, in some places it doesn't. So you gotta be, careful with that stuff. People show up in, June, July, and August, and there's a huge introduction of nitrogen into the system.
But I'm just talking about the long-term data that the Providence Center for Coastal Studies has, which shows in 42 different stations the same pattern, which is an increase starting in March and parabola-shaped peak in the summertime, falling off to a low level in November. So there's not a lot of nitrogen anywhere around the Cape in the wintertime.
I would challenge that.
Well, it's just the data. It's the end of the
But their data collections drop off in November. They don't sample between November and April. So yeah, there isn't any data on nitrogen because that's not the sampling season for them.
But in March, it doesn't suddenly go up after November and then drop again before March.
You don't know what the data is because we don't have it. No.
So, I'm back to biomass. One of our problems here in the spring, I was going to say something else, but to tag on to what Kurt just said. We get a huge number of people opening houses and businesses walloping their septic systems with all kinds of cleaning fluids and other very toxic things that the biomass under septic systems, which is most of Wellfleet, can't handle. And here in Wellfleet, we've got the park and we can't put septic sewage treatment, places in the park. And we have these different aquifers, these different lenses of water, and we have a lot of very shallow areas in terms of the land mass. And when we were looking at where you could possibly put a waste treatment center back in the early 2000s, we were really limited. And what else came to light was any place that you had that treatment happening and the water that was treated, unless it was treated back to drinking water, which is way too expensive, going back into the ground was really going to screw things up. And therefore, I personally started looking at how people treat their septic systems. So this is what I was saying the other night, not to bore you if you were there too, but I treat my septic system and therefore the biomat under it, which is like its digestive tract, as if it was a newborn baby, quite literally. I put nothing in there that, even if we don't know everything that our sanitizing liquids and our various cleaning liquids and our shampoos and so forth do to our individual septic systems and therefore the groundwater around them. We do know that some things can hurt it, and I just simply avoid them. And it's pretty easy. And it surprises me how childlike we are about these things that are more essential to our drinking water wells and our neighbors' drinking water wells than our cars. I mean, people understand that their cars can break. Meanwhile, there's this living organism under their septic system, which is like this kind of little eco entity, right? Made up of a lot of different things, just like our bodies. We've got, a biome that's like incredibly complex. And we mistreat it all the time. I used to clean houses. My hair stood on end. So that is, in Wellfleet, something that will not be a magic bullet if every single person was treating their septic system decently, but it's yet another thing that we can add to having things go better. And alternative systems only work well if you don't use them, right?
And if you don't shut them off.
Yes, and Helen, the wastewater committee, the very first thing the wastewater committee did was actually produce a best practices guide for your septic system. It's on the town website.
Yes, I've seen it.
And so it addresses almost everything that you just mentioned, but and some others. But it's an excellent piece if you're interested. You're looking for that kind of information, but it is on the town website to find that septic best practices guide. When we undertook it, 7 years ago, we looked all over, and EPA doesn't have it. You're right, Ellen. I mean, it's amazing how little information there is about caring for your septic system.
Yeah, I mean, use white vinegar instead of, some of the other things that promise to do everything for you. And by the way, don't work that well. Okay? I'm a professional house cleaner back in the day, so.
Yes.
The trouble is you can't do much about the renters that come in. They'll do anything they want to.
Who?
The renters who populate the town.
You can put things up, you can supply cleaning, stuff for them. You cannot use detergents that are, egregious. It really does make a small difference. And if you can keep your biosystem alive. One of the things about cluster systems, small, what Kurt refers to as satellite systems, is, if we had one down around the harbor, we could keep it cooking gently over the winter simply by the marina, the harbor master's building using it. If you keep it cooking through the winter, when you get the bulb on Memorial Day, it doesn't hurt it, in the same way.
Yes.
Just a couple of things. Josh, right? Yeah, I'm really, really glad to hear you being so honest about how, what these oysters have proven to or to not have done. I'm an oyster grower here in Wellfleet, as you know. You see me out there on the grant a lot. One of the things about the oysters being so caught up in the wastewater management programs is I wish that we could somehow make sure that the public doesn't suddenly think that oysters being used for wastewaters are shitsters and that they're not going to be edible. And that why would you want to eat an animal? I mean, this could ruin our industry. The other thing is so many towns dumping so much into it, like the Lonnie Pond thing did. Yeah. And those oysters went to Falmouth. And those oysters hit the market way before they were supposed to. And those guys sold them for dirt cheap. And they ruined our fall for good producing people. Yeah. So it's really important that too many oysters don't get put all over the place for these projects, that therefore get opened up and destroy our markets. It's wonderful to hear Barbara say, well, why don't we put them in areas where they're going to stay in the ecosystem, they're going to continue to filter. And I think they're, like you were saying, they're a great part of a problem, but they're not the silver bullet. And one thing that I thought was really interesting recently I heard about was like, we've got to start thinking differently, like the Phragmites, that, we need to get how do I say it? Glyphosate? Roundup. And we need to kill all this Phragmite because we don't want that in the Herring River system. Apparently Phragmites suck up a ton of nitrogen and they can be used, if they're chopped at the right time of the year and pulled out of the system, they do just as much as oysters do. So if you could do a combination, like you look behind Moby Dick's and all the Phragmites are centered right around that restaurant. The rest of it's still all cattails. If we could start combining some of these things and, maybe using the Phragmites and embracing them instead of just trying to kill them and calling them an invasive species. And we need to do different things. It can't all be one thing because everything, as you say, is interlocked, including our industry. And I just hate to keep thinking that people are thinking of oysters as sewer systems. Thank you.
Scott Lindell was also looking at algae, wasn't he, a while back? Did anything ever become that, like growing algae to partly to remove nitrogen, then harvesting it and selling it?
Yeah, they've been looking at it. Do you know anything about it?
So part of the challenge there is kelp needs to be grown in more offshore water, away from where the problem is, and they actually become nutrient limited out there. And then growing stuff inshore in estuaries, biofouling just becomes a huge issue, and then it's not consumable. So
there was some use of algae as a polishing filter in Yarmouth. There was a little test site that was done, and they were growing algae and then running the effluent after the treatment train through to take out some of the residual nitrogen that left. And, it works, but it's at the end of a conventional treatment process. So it's, again, this idea like, let's put it out there for a while, algae is going to be the way we're going to treat our way out of it. Yeah, but you still have to build a treatment plant, you still have to build a collection system, you still have to get the wastewater to the facility to run it. So, any other thoughts? We're close to wrap up.
I just have a question. So I've heard from some of the growers that they're concerned with having oyster restoration reefs where oysters would be allowed to just continue to grow. Is that in 3 years or so, that dermo will actually kill them? In Wellfleet Harbor, we have that. So can you speak to that? And that with oyster restoration leaf reefs left unharvested, that we could have die-off and then they can become a benefit disease. So that's just what I'm hearing from some of them. Can you?
Yeah, no, that's a very real concern from growers' perspective. So dermo and MSX, they're endemic to the environment here, and they tend to be somewhat cyclical. And they're also cumulative, so over the course of an oyster's life, they'll get more and more of it. And there's other things in the environment we still don't understand yet that make it somewhat cyclical. Some years are hotter, so to speak, than others in terms of disease. But yeah, as they get older and older, there's more and more risk of disease issues. So if you have a reef that's 6 or 7 years old, you probably have oysters that have a ton of disease that was cumulative over the years. So in a grower's perspective, they want them to grow as big as quickly as possible and get them out because it reduces your risk. So, I mean, there is the potential for disease reservoirs from reef and restoration type efforts. There is some data out there that suggests otherwise, maybe, but again, it is a real concern.
I would also argue that if you have a reef that's healthy, that you're selecting for the disease-resistant oysters.
But there could be a pandemic before you get to that disease-resistant oyster. So,
I just have another question.
Yeah, it's just in listening to all this, it's obvious that it's a complex system. You've got bacteria that fix nitrogen out there. There's different, but a piece of data I'm just wondering if anybody's ever gathered is the simple wholesale tonnage of fertilizer that comes across the bridge. It's something, you can tabulate it. Has anybody done that?
how much fertilizer comes on to keep that?
Probably not.
It's a number, it's to give you a mass.
It is, but the general estimate of, it's the human septic nitrogen that drives the water quality problem, not
that's secondary.
It's not an insignificant or unimportant portion, and it's the low-hanging fruit.
Okay.
Right? It doesn't require you to do much of anything different than you're currently doing except stop fertilizing your lawn.
Right.
But it doesn't solve the problem. It's worth doing. And there's a whole industry out there that fight you tooth and nail on it. So, just in wrapping up, I want to thank Josh and Mark for coming, and thank everybody for attending, asking, and contributing to a thoughtful conversation. Go home and do something about this. It doesn't matter if it's exactly the right, you won't get the right answer, and you won't get a consensus that whatever municipal action you're going to plan on taking is unanimously approved by everybody. But start down a road and do something that you think has a basis for making things better, and don't just wait for the perfect solution. Because we've been waiting for the perfect solution and we're watching our resources die off. And if we continue to do that, we're pretty sure that they're going to continue to die off. And then there's going to be so little memory of what was lost that the urgency to restore it will become even less than it currently is. So for those of us who've been around for a while, remember some iteration of what old Cape Cod and water quality and habitat used to look like. It's up to us to drive some of the restoration efforts now, because shifting baseline. My son's baseline is what he grew up with in the last 20 years, and it's a hell of a lot different than my baseline was. And it's probably a lot different than what Alan's baseline was. and a number of others in the room. So if we lose that opportunity, how far back people are going to be willing to fight to get is going to be a lot less. And the last thing that I think is useful for this conversation is I heard a comment President Obama made recently, maybe miss him even more. Better is good. It's not perfect, but just doing something that makes things better is a good outcome. And as a group of environmentalists, we are really good at getting around the table in a circle, talking about how we're going to solve this problem and opening fire on one another, because we can't agree on what the perfect solution is. So if there's a reasonable sense that you're going to take a step back in your community that can make conditions better, take it. You know, we're expecting a level of certainty in order to be able to move on this issue that exceeds the level of certainty that we have when we do anything else. Anybody invest in the stock market? Anybody get a 401k? You don't know what the performance is going to be in the future, and yet we all shovel our money into it. Why? Because we have some reasonable expectation that it's going to get better. Why can't we do something around water resources that's similar to that and just get started? We've been talking about this and talking about it. And yeah, there's uncertainty, and there always will be. Because the more we learn that we don't know as much as we thought we did when we started the expedition. It doesn't mean that it's not worth starting to do something. And if you do something that's wrong, we'll stop doing it and do something else. But not doing something is doing something. It's sitting back and letting it get worse. So go home and change it. Thanks.